Once again, we bring you this special episode of QueerSammelan, and today we are joined by someone very special with whom we are going to talk about life of a trans person. A trans person whose life is never been bothered about. Today is the time when we have an expert for you to understand a trans person's life very closely. Joining me from Britain is Catherine Wyers, who has been, I think there's been a year, Catherine, meeting you. And I'm very happy today that you're joining me here on the panel. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, let me introduce you to Catherine. She is the doctoral researcher at University of Oslo in Norway, and she's been researching upon transgender health equity and information systems. Um, Catherine, let me begin asking you. We from our childhood are taught that there are two boxes in which you have to fit yourself, either a man or a woman. When a transgender grows up, they start exploring themselves. They find that they are somewhere different from they find that they are not able to fit themselves in any of the box. So I want to know from you how a trans person's life is different from a man and a woman, and why should it be categorized as a third gender as it has been done in India?
Yeah, see, that's a very difficult question. I mean, to start, you introduced me as an expert. An expert is it's quite a jump to assume that I'm an expert. I am conducting research on transgender health and a particular health program, how that's rolled out in India. And what I research is around categories, around classification, around how people are grouped in society into who gets access to some service and who doesn't get access to a service. So your question kind of what you're asking is, why should transgender people be grouped as separate from male and female, which is kind of an interesting question. Yeah. And there's many different perspectives on whether they should and whether that's the right thing to do. Like there's so many different perspectives on this. Fundamentally, what all people need, and what all people deserve is to be healthy, to have access to healthcare, to have access to the things that they need in order to live healthy, happy lives with lots of well-being. So what within the health system, so where I'm studying and where the area I'm researching is in Himachal Pradesh, and I met you in Chandigarh, and I traveled to Delhi as well. So I've traveled to a few different places in northern India to kind of talk around how society is kind of looking at the transgender community and how they're being kind of organized within society. Whether they should be separated at all from male or female, I guess that's kind of, there's a historical side to that, but then there's also kind of there's many different sides to it. I think that's kind of what I'm understanding from what's taking place within India. There's kind of a move to separate transgender people and view transgender people as being separate from male and separate from female. But that's not necessarily from the grassroots what all transgender people need. There are transgender people who identify as female. There's transgender people who identify as a third gender. There's transgender people who identify as male. So it's to kind of to group people and to separate transgender people out from male and female as kind of a blanket decision. It's not always so simple. You know, it's much more complex. There's a lot of nuance even in that question of like, should this be happening and why should this happen? You know, there's so much nuance in this. And I think that's where That's where the difficulties come in, because once you decide
Yeah.
this is a service that's only available for transgender people, or as you say, transgenders, um, then those people who are assigned male at birth, but then grow up
Yeah.
to identify as female, if they identify as female rather than transgender,
Hmm.
the question is then, do they fit within that category? You know, so
Hmm.
it's kind of a roundabout, long answer to your question.
So what I can understand, this question cannot have a single answer. I don't think. Um, but moving beyond from recognition, you talked about healthcare and education also, on which you've been researching since long. Um, I just want to know about your research. That um, what were you actually researching upon? What were those different issues, or I would say the health facilities that you had researched upon, and you want that transgender people should get those facilities in the countries and in every part of the world?
Yeah. So the program that I'm looking at is called the SMILE program. It's a program by the Department of Social Justice and Empowerment, SMILE, SMILE. And part of that is providing what they call the composite health package, or the composite healthcare package,
Hmm.
for transgender people. So it's a program that seeks to include transgender people within society, providing scholarships for education,
Hmm.
access to gender affirming healthcare. And by gender affirming healthcare, I mean like surgeries,
Hmm.
hormones, but then also um, like counseling, therapies, whatever it is that that person needs in order to access their own well-being and to live a healthy life. Um, so what I'm looking at then is this SMILE program, which is being rolled out in all states across the Indian subcontinent.
Hmm.
And each state is going to have an impaneled hospital which provides this care. It's connected in some way to the Ayushman Bharat um, uh, health insurance program. And the purpose of the SMILE program is to give access to healthcare, to gender affirming healthcare for all transgender people living in India. So that's broadly the program that I'm looking at.
Hmm.
And within that, what in practice, what I'm looking at is like when we speak about all transgender people living in India,
Hmm.
are the conversations around transgender people, do they cover all people who are transgender? And are there certain people who are not being included within those conversations?
Yeah.
Um, for example, transgender men, and by transgender men, I mean a person who's assigned female at birth and then identifies as male
Hmm.
and then lives their life as a man, as a male person, um, or a person who's non-binary and doesn't identify with male or female.
Hmm.
Um, so that's kind of there's many different identities that could be connected to transgender people, or the word transgender.
Hmm.
And I'm exploring, like, are all transgender people included in the conversations? Who's being excluded from the conversations? Are there certain voices that are being heard a lot more than others? And how can we kind of shape a conversation
Yeah.
that includes everybody, so that fewer people are kind of being left out?
Hmm. Actually, that spectrum is very large, where we define sexualities and gender. That spectrum is very large, and um, in India, we have three columns now. Earlier, we had for man and women in different forms when we go to hospitals or any government institution. Now we have a third column for transgender people. I think this question is something related to the first one only. Um, but I just wanna, I'm interested in knowing this. Is there need to expand that transgender column and divide it further into more columns, as you said, that even in the transgender community, people recognize themselves in more different ways. So, do you think there's such need?
My sense of it is that well, yes, there like I feel that the word transgender is quite restrictive. I think the challenge at the moment is the separation out of people into categories.
Yeah.
Like take a when somebody identifies as transgender, immediately separating them out from male or female.
Hmm.
And that certainly works for many, many people. There's many people who identify in that way and who identify as a third gender,
Hmm.
who would identify as neither man nor woman. And that works perfectly well for them.
Yeah.
But it may, and there are certainly cases where there are people who are being separated out from that. There was a campaign a few years ago called the I Am Not a Hijra campaign,
Hmm.
which was it was kind of a social media campaign
Okay.
around 2015, 2016, where people who are transgender, I think primarily transgender women, but there were transgender men in this as well. And they kind of um, they sought to identify as, and the transgender women sought to identify as female and saying, we are female, we are not
Hmm.
third gender, we are not, as they themselves said, we are not Hijra. We are, the person who was speaking in this campaign, one of the people said, I'm female. That's it, I'm just a female. So she had her Aadhaar card updated to female. Her legal identity was female. All her documentation changed to female, and then she was female. So that person is a transgender person, and a transgender person living in India,
Hmm.
but doesn't identify with the third gender idea. So, um, we, um, so creating a third category and saying, okay, we have male, we have female, now we have transgender. That is the category where transgender people go. Um, it it's it it is a step in the right direction,
Hmm.
but there are people who don't necessarily fit within those groupings.
Ah.
There are people who are assigned male at birth, who then grow up to identify as female,
Hmm.
and then get legal identity, which is female, identify as female,
Hmm.
and then live their lives as female.
Yeah.
Um, so to group all people into male and female and then other or transgender or kinner or hijra, these kind of groups, um, it's a lot more complex than that.
Yeah.
And when those categories get when membership, when your access to healthcare and your access to well-being relies on you identifying with a certain category,
Hmm.
identifying with the word transgender, when the word transgender means something separate to male and separate to female,
Hmm.
that's when the challenges start happening.
Hmm.
You know?
It's quite complicated for everyone to actually, just understand what actually a trans person is feeling. And ahead of that are more challenges which are to be seen by the governments or by the people who really actually are said that they think. Um, well, moving ahead, I would talk about education. I was going through your profile. I saw, are you still studying? You have had too many degrees. I was glad to see that. And apart from that, I would say you're very beautiful. If I would call you synonym of beauty, it won't be wrong. So, beauty plus education, these two things you have. But Along with you, I'll consider the whole transgender community too. How education helps a trans person to survive in the world.
That's a good question. Well, education is so fundamental to access to income. Like access to the way I view things through the lens of well-being. Very much through through sort of seeing what is it that something lets a person aspire to.
Hmm.
What do you feel like you can achieve with your life?
Hmm.
And does the thing that you're being provided in life, does that let you imagine a life that's much bigger, one that you can aspire to more things? How do you see the future? And what education is able to do is by ensuring that somebody has an education, they can see themselves in a role in the
Hmm.
future. They can see themselves in in a housing situation, in a career situation that that is much more expansive than what they would have if they didn't have the education. So, like a qualification gives you access to a career, but it gives you so much more than that. Like a career is not just an income. A career is money that lets you buy a house. It lets you buy security, but it also lets you imagine that you have a very valuable place within society. Like you can see that if you get a high school qualification, that means that you have more control over your life. You have more options. You have more choices for what you can achieve in life. Um, Unfortunately, within the trans community, when people are children and when they're teenagers,
Hmm.
they experience a lot of stigma, a lot of discrimination, a lot of oppression, a lot of being having these aspirations
Yeah.
squeezed in and pressed together. So it is difficult for a teenage transgender person to aspire to something in the same way that a non-transgender, so a cisgender person
Yeah.
would, because of that stigma, about because of that sense that there's less that that person can achieve in life. So it starts from there. It starts from when children, when teenagers experience stigma and experience that doors are being closed, that leads to problems. One of the fantastic solutions that so you introduced Dhananjay Chauhan.
Yeah.
Um, yes, so the work that Dhananjay has done for
Challenge.
providing access to the university,
Yeah.
like creating spaces where a transgender person is able to access education,
Yeah.
just even sensing that there's a place for you at a university, as in like that a university is a place where you can go.
Hmm.
That like for a teenager to think, what's my future going to be like? Well, actually, there's a way to get an education. There's a way to get that qualification that I need to do the thing that I want to do in the future. It's so valuable, and it's completely
Hmm.
expands what somebody can feel they can aspire to. And that's fundamental to so many things, you know?
Um, Education opens too many doors for you. Um, but I was thinking right now that if you'll go to study, you need security also. You cannot compromise your education with your security. What do you think educational institutions, plus I will include the other institutions as well, where you will go to job or for other purposes as well? What do you think should be the security arrangements that should be made for the transgender people, which will actually prove a favorable and a good environment for them?
Um, Um, I am in no way an expert to answer a question like that, but because my expertise lies in a completely different area.
Okay.
But but what I would say generally is what's very important is to listen to people who, if somebody comes to you, if you're an employer,
Yeah.
and this is not specific to a university, it's generally to employers.
Hmm.
If you're an employer and somebody comes to you with a complaint,
Hmm.
and that person is saying, this is connected to my gender identity, this is connected to my transgender status, this is connected to the way that I present my gender in a day-to-day life. The first thing to do there is to actually listen, to really try to, rather than dismissing it. I think a large problem is that that it's possible for somebody to kind of say, "Oh, that's not such a big deal. Why are you complaining so much?" Like that's a problem. That person who is coming to you with this complaint has sat and worried about that for a very long time.
Need of
So you can
sensitization.
create a space by actually really listening to what somebody says if somebody has an issue,
Yeah.
you know?
There's need for the sensitization basically. People need to understand what mentally a transgender person feels and what are the challenges they face. And
Yeah.
after that, an environment that is favorable for them can be made. Moving
Yeah.
ahead, let's talk about India and the world. You've been to India, you've been to Dharamshala for a long time. You've seen transgender people here in India. They live, they uh, they work for themselves, they live their life, but still there's a belief that in India transgenders are is a marginalized group in a certain way. So how do you compare the condition of transgender people in India to that you've seen in the world?
Good question. Um, um, it's it's a different fight. Like something I find very interesting about the way that the state is responding to the calls of transgender people in India is by separating transgender people from male and female.
Yeah.
Like I find that a really interesting way of approaching that, and certainly with like several people within the transgender community who I've spoken to are very much identify with transgender as being a third gender, as being very separate. Um, which is not something that would take place in Western Europe. In Western Europe, if you are assigned male at birth and you identify as female, then you update your legal documents to female, which is very different from updating your legal documents to transgender. So I think that's a big difference. Um, I do feel like there's a perception, and I've heard it from a few places, that there's a perception in India that outside India things are better, and that in the West things are better, that in the United States, that in Europe things are better for transgender people, that it's much easier to get jobs,
That's
to
a
get
perception. Yeah.
housing. Hmm?
There's a perception over here. People
There's
say,
a perception
yeah.
there, yeah. And like certainly, I mean, I was very lucky. I was able to get an education. I got my education before I transitioned. Most of my education, I got it before I transitioned.
Hmm.
Um, and it's quite a different thing. It's a different, like, I mean, there's the collective struggle that all trans people have to be able to get the support that they need, um, to be able to get education, to be able to get jobs, career, family, fertility, be able to have children, raise a family, be in a relationship, get married. These are all struggles. Um, what I find interestingly in India is the 2019 Transgender Protection of the Persons Act, which was a parliamentary decision to provide institutional representation, institutional kind of legal identity for transgender people, which is very different
Yeah.
to the way that it was handled in the West. You
Hmm.
know, there isn't a transgender act in Europe or in the area, the parts of Europe that I know, because
Yeah.
each country in Europe is, of course, its own country. Um, but yeah, and kind of in a large sense, there's like there's trans people in England, in Norway.
Hmm.
They um they try to become part of the gender that they identify with.
Hmm.
So a transgender person who's assigned female at birth identifies as male, updates the identity, lives their life as male,
Hmm.
then continues on, and that's fine. Of course, has troubles, has issues, um, and but there's so many overlaps as well. You know, there might be a perception in India that things are different, that things are somehow far better in other countries. But like the struggle is there's lots of overlaps. There's
Hmm.
lots of parallels in trying to, like, transgender people
Hmm.
identifying, presenting their identity, saying, this is how I identify, this is how I want to live my life.
Hmm.
And then society going, yes, but we're not going to allow that, or we're going to allow you to have this small little piece. So
Hmm.
I think the similarities are more than the differences, you
Hmm.
know, but there's huge differences, of course. I mean, I mean, I'm very lucky in that as you say, I have plenty of qualifications
Hmm.
that I was lucky enough to be able to get, because there's the institutions were available for me to be able to get an education.
Hmm.
And yeah, and I feel very lucky that I'm able to conduct research in India, you know, as somebody from the West, from Western Europe. So clearly, like, I'm very aware of my own privilege in that respect, in that respect. But yeah, there's, like, all trans people experience
Hmm.
pushback, experience stigma, discrimination, and so much of it comes from the way that society is structured, the way that systems exist, the way that the health system
Hmm.
tries to push people into the sex assigned to them at birth, or tries to create this binary system, or tries to kind of organize society,
Yeah.
and anyone who kind of veers outside that and says, actually, I identify in this way rather than that way.
Hmm.
Um, there's kind of institutional pushback. There's like the system kind of pushes you back and says you shouldn't do that. But it's in much the same way as if you're a gay person who is in a same-sex relationship and then
Hmm.
wants to get married. You know, you can experience, like, lots of love and respect from the
Yeah.
people around if they're compassionate.
Hmm.
But then if you try to get married in, for example, in India, um, there's a lot of dialogue, conversations going on at the moment around
Same-sex.
same-sex marriages, and that's the systemic issues. There's, like, deep systems. There's, like, ways of thinking that are so deeply embedded within society, and that's, like, you know, in most countries in the world. I won't say all countries, because I'm not
Um.
familiar with all countries, but, like, it's so common that this fundamental belief that
Oh.
that, you know, marriage is between a man and a woman.
Yeah.
People, a person who is born as a girl will grow up to become a woman
Yeah.
and live as a woman. A person who's born as a boy will grow up to live as a man. That is the way that it has to be. And that's obviously not the way it has to be, because there's so much more diversity in society.
Yeah. Um.
Yeah.
India is a diverse country, and when we talk about transgender people, there's more diversity. And today we live in an India where we have scrapped down the Article 377, which
Mhm.
criminalized homosexuality, but now it's legal in India. After that, we are moving ahead with the hope that same-sex marriage get legalized in India. Whereas, as Catherine says, is she thinks that whatever gender a trans person feels like to express, that should be recognized instead of putting that totally into a third gender, or we should be simply respectful to the person's pronouns, which he or she or they would prefer to be called with. um, well, Catherine, it was great talking to you. At the last, I just want to ask you, the stage is open to you. Whatever you want to appeal from people, you can. And plus, I will request you to include some part of mental health also, because that becomes very important for people to understand, so that they can have, I would say, a sympathetic heart for trans people.
Yeah. Well, since I have the floor, um, it all comes down to love. It all comes down to compassion. You know, as you say, um, it's we shouldn't be putting people into boxes. We shouldn't be saying this is
Yeah.
who you are, this is what you're about, this is the kind of person that you are. We need to listen. We need, if somebody says I identify in this way,
Hmm.
this is who I am, then it has to come back down to compassion and love and understanding and
Yeah.
trying to really understand what that person needs. And from there, it flows into mental health issues that people can have if they're being restricted, if they're stigmatized, if
Hmm.
they're discriminated against, if they're just fundamentally, if they're not being listened to. Somebody says, look, I identify as a non-binary person. You go, okay, what are your pronouns? They, them. If that's the case, then fantastic. Let's move on. Because like trans people, like trans people aren't really that
Hmm.
unique, you know, like it's just, you know,
Um,
it's not really as special as people seem to think it is, you know. Like they just
uh,
they just want to get on with their lives and have a job and have a relationship and, you know, just get married and own a house and
yeah.
that's all. Like, you know, like they're not looking for anything massive. They're just looking for people to go, okay, where's the space for me? Creating space for somebody to feel comfortable, where they can really flourish and where they can really, really just be live a happy life that they want, you know? And that comes in starts when they're kids, having that space within the family structure. If your child says, look, I think I identify in this way. Of course, it's very difficult to hear your child saying it, but at the same time, go, okay, well, you know, I won't say no. I'll just like listen. And it's the same with if an employer is, if you're an employer and you hear somebody saying this, or you hear that they're having an issue with it, you listen, you be compassionate, and that's fundamentally it, you know.
Hmm.
Of course, there needs to be institutional change as well. There needs to be like
Hmm.
mental health services need to be provided for people who have unfortunately not experienced that space that they needed to flourish. So they're kind of they're sort of stuck with the need for mental health services. There's institutionally, the health system needs to provide care for trans people. Society needs to be more have more space for trans people so that they can get the services that they need, mental health services, gender affirming care services, education, access to education, feeling like they're safe within an institution. So like it needs the societal change and it needs an institutional change.
Yeah.
And both of those things need to be happening.
Hmm. Sorry to interrupt, but
Um,
we have a very less time left. So, if somebody has to survive in a society, then respect is actually asked equivalent. And I think in response to respect is when you basically earn respect from another person. So, after talking to you, I think whosoever will listen to this interview will get an idea what are the challenges that a trans person has to face, and will really sensitize themselves to make a better society. Well, that was an interview with you, Catherine, and I'm very thankful to you that you made out time and talked to us. And thank you so much for
You're
joining.
very welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me onto the show.